And that gave birth to the Global Commons Alliance, which is the endeavor of trying to scale and have a much more integrated approach to the stewardship of all the biophysical natural systems on Earth, from the ice sheets to the rainforest to the ocean systems, that we call the global commons, the big biophysical systems that we all depend on, but that we all collectively depend on their sustainable, safe, and just operation.
Well, next to me here, I'm delighted to finally, on a stage, physically, we've been moderating on and off on sessions on Zoom for years now.
It's incredible.
Yes.
You're a real person.
Yes, you are too, Shweta. It's fantastic. So this is Dr. Shweta Chakraborty. She's president of the US operations, so we don't have time. And she's going to take care of this session about, well, you just heard the introduction, and I'll hand it over to you, Shweta.
Thank you so much, Katarina. So in addition to being the US president of We Don't Have Time, I'm also proud to be a steering committee member for the Global Commons Alliance. And we are kicking off now our segment where we are going to ask, how can we become planetary stewards? This question contains another that we often hear. I know climate change is a big issue. I know the planet and nature are hurting. I know that historical injustices have shaped our reality. But what can I do? It's an understandable question that we will address tonight, along with much more. Along the way, we'll be reminded of the beauty of the planet that is our home, which now desperately needs our care. The challenge in front of us is an emergency, but together we are up to the task. Whether we succeed will depend on how urgently humanity can redefine our relationships with each other and with the natural Earth systems we all depend on, toward the balance that we need for life to thrive on our planet. We're facing a global food crisis. We're seeing incredible heat waves in India and Pakistan. Human activities are destroying our nature, and we're crossing irreversible tipping points that are giving rise to anti-democratic and nationalistic forces. Whether we succeed in overcoming these challenges will depend on how urgently humanity can redefine our relationships. And this is what we are going to get into. I am thrilled to introduce our first two guests. We have Professor Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and co-chair of the Earth Commission. It's also my pleasure to introduce Johan's Earth Commission co-chair, Joyita Gupta. Previously, she was co-chair of UNEP's Global Environment Outlook 6. And we also have Gie Bastida, a Mexican climate activist and member of the indigenous Otomi Toltec Nation. She is one of the major organizers of Fridays for a Future in New York and has been a leading voice in indigenous and immigrant visibility in climate activism. She is co-founder of Re-Earth Initiative, an international not-for-profit that is inclusive and intersectional. So it is my pleasure to bring these three panelists on stage.
So okay, cool. Okay.
Please have a seat.
Thanks.
We were expecting people to climb over the couches.
Oh, okay. Just like this.
No acrobatics needed today. We have much more serious things to discuss. Okay, so thank you all for joining me here. We are kicking off Stockholm +50 with incredible perspectives on where we've been since World Environment Day started, where we're going. So the most important question to start this segment is, why are we talking about the Global Commons Alliance in the first place? Why is it so important?
Yeah, so when we met here in Stockholm in 1972, we were still, a relatively small world on a big planet. We could afford to exploit and pollute and, overload with greenhouse gases in the atmosphere without having major invoices being sent back and hitting us very hard, threatening human well-being, but also the stability of the planet. But as we've been moving along, and actually we could take the first slide right away because it actually shows quite nicely this journey that we've been making over the past 50 years, if we can get that. Oh, there it is. Wonderful. No, it's the previous one. There we are. So 1972, we had defined the global commons being the global property resources that are beyond national borders, owned by nobody, where we have kind of free access, Antarctica, the high seas, the atmosphere, and outer space. But these were the only global commons. We have treaties for them of how to collaborate in their management. But since we advance our science, and we have the IPCC born in 1990, we have the sixth assessment, which we've just finalized, but you also have the advancement of science showing that we've entered the Anthropocene, a whole new geological epoch. We're putting pressure on the planet at a point where we risk its stability and ability to support humanity. And if you take the next slide, we have today the scientific evidence that we have large biophysical systems on Earth that regulates the stability of the entire Earth system. And what you see on this slide is the latest assessment of the 9 of the known 15 large biophysical systems, we call them tipping elements, that are showing signs of instability, that they're approaching tipping points. And if a system like this, like the Greenland ice sheet, or the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, or the Amazon rainforest crosses a tipping point, it goes from being our best friend, dampening and reducing impacts of, for example, global warming, to start amplifying a journey in the wrong direction. That is why we scientifically today consider that we have to redefine the global commons. We have to move away from only thinking it of being systems far away that nobody owns, that are kind of beyond our responsibility, to now becoming the systems amongst them that you see on this screen, namely the large biophysical systems, from the living biosphere to the climate system, to the physics systems and the biological systems in the ocean, that regulates the ability for all of us as citizens on Earth to have a stable, good Earth system to live on. So that is what we're working on scientifically within the Global Commons Alliance, and we think that translating that into legal, institutional, and governance issues, I mean, we have Rita Gupta, my fellow co-chair of the Earth Commission, as a lawyer. You can just imagine what that is going to mean if we translate that to real manageable and governable units, both in terms of compensating for good stewardship, but also in terms of accountability. So it's, we think, a piece of the puzzle of moving forward for humanity on Earth.
Fantastic. Lots of information in there. And I want to pull out one concept and really emphasize it, tipping points. Please explain exactly what you mean by tipping points. Why are tipping points so crucial and critical, especially right now?
Now, what we've learned over the scientific advancements over the past 30 years is that systems on planet Earth, from physical systems like ice sheets to living systems like ecosystems, have what we call multiple stable states. You could think of them as deep cups or basins of attraction. And over the last 12,000 years, all these systems have established themselves in very harmonious and stable basins of attraction that can support us. So think of the carbon stocks in frozen permafrost, or the beautiful diversity in a rainforest where Xie comes from, or from wetlands, or coral reef systems, or ice sheets. They are configured in a stable basin of attraction that support us. They cool the planet, they provide us food, they provide clean air, they give us rainfall. They are part of the Holocene. They're part of the configuration, the organs of a healthy planet. If you push those too far by emitting greenhouse gases, or deforesting, or polluting, or degrading, they will come closer to a threshold, and at a very specific point, an exact point, they will fall over this threshold, and irreversibly, because they change feedback dynamics, they change the forces that keeps them either in the basin of attraction we want them in, or they will self-amplify into a new basin, and a rainforest can suddenly tip over and irreversibly become a savanna. Or an ice sheet tips over and irreversibly moves into melting, and it's unstoppable. That is what makes it a tipping point. That's what makes it, let's say, we must stay away from those points. And I should really close by emphasizing that these tipping points are very exact physical points. The only reason why we have uncertainties in science is that we don't know yet, because we haven't advanced the science as far. But they are as exact as we have learned through trial and error as humans, that there's a tipping point on body temperature. You know, all of us operate against the point that you don't want to go beyond 42 degrees, because then you shift from a desired state, you're alive, to a quite undesired state, you die. That's a tipping point.
these are exactly the same things for these systems I showed here. The only reason why we have fuzziness is that they interact, and we have not the exact point when the ice sheet moves towards, from a point where it reflects heat to a point where it absorbs heat. So remember that these are really hardwired systems of the planet.
You are communicating the science so clearly. You're also communicating the uncertainty very clearly. And yet we still have this challenge of communicating the science to the public, really getting people to recognize their role as environmental stewards and redefining the global commons and the role we all play in it. Shea, let me come to you. What have you learned in your experiences as someone who is mobilizing different citizens around the world to recognize this new definition of the global commons and our role as planetary stewards? What have you learned about communicating science and the challenges that you've come across?
Well, I'll start by saying that I'm one of the organizers for the climate strike. So our role is really, can you hear me well? Yeah?
Yes.
Our role is really to communicate the science in terms that can be absorbed by people and understood by people. And so it's a hard task, because how do you communicate everything that Johan is talking about, the IPCC report, and tell it to people in a way that it's digestible and actionable? And what we have learned really is that, first of all, the psychological distance narrative that Johan was also talking about, of it's too far away from us, it's too far away in the future, has not really resonated with people. So we have to be able to share stories, and we have to be able to tell people, in my town, water is being taken away. In my town, there's a mega project that was built on our aquifer. And this type of stories is what move people emotionally. And I have to be able to look at you in the eye and tell you that I'm scared for my future being taken away in front of me, and connect that to the science, because people are 20 times more likely to remember scientific facts when they're tied to storytelling. So that's what we've learned. Tell stories, share your feelings, connect them to data, and also understand that people have a finite pool of worry, meaning that I can only worry about so much in my life at a time. I have school, I have family, and for some people, bringing in the environment seems a little insensitive. How are you telling me to care about the environment when I'm caring about making enough money to raise my children, stuff like that? And that's when we need to connect the intersectionality of the climate crisis and say your food security relies on the security of the global commons. Your water security relies on the security of the global commons. And these are the things that we're trying to communicate, and not look at science as something that is isolated, but something that is connected. And yeah, this is the perspective we're bringing, trying to make connections and meet people where they're at, so that we really say it like it is, and we say it with data that is happening now, stories that are happening now and not in the future.
And that's exactly right. And advances in behavioral science and communication science underpin everything you just said. So incredible. That's true. The science won't change, the evidence won't change, the facts won't change, but how we translate that to communities around the world, that we have control of and we can do better in. And Joyita, I know you're doing this. I know that you are thinking about how to translate this information and really make the future equitable. How do we ensure that we usher in a future that is just, that it truly brings everybody along so that nobody is left behind? That is something we haven't historically been able to do successfully, but there's an opportunity here to actually see that through. How do you think about it?
So let me try and translate what Johan said in terms of the global commons, because if it's a commons that we want to protect, then we probably want to come up with some kind of boundaries. Now, those boundaries are defined perhaps at a safe limit from a tipping point, which has just been explained. But then when you try to communicate that boundary to somebody, as you're trying to talk about, it doesn't communicate, because then you're talking about 1.5 degrees centigrade. It doesn't relate to people. So what you have to then try and do is, are these safe boundaries also safe for people today? And that brings you to a slightly different discussion. And it could be that some of these safe boundaries are safe for people today, and some of them are not. Now, if they're not safe for people today, we might need more stringent boundaries. And if you can meet those stringent boundaries, then you have a higher chance of ensuring that you don't cross the safe boundaries. So this is one way to look at the boundaries. But again, if you say that even at 1.5 degrees, many millions of people may be affected, and so therefore it may not be safe enough, and therefore we need to find a new just boundary, that means basically what you're telling the world is that they really have to use much less energy, for example, or eat much less meat. Now, when you're doing that, you're trying to divide this total amount of available energy or available food amongst everybody. Now, what we have found in our work is that if you want to meet the basic needs of people, whether it's food, water, energy, or infrastructure, and you don't change the rest of the world, then it's going to be more than likely that you cross the safe and just planetary boundaries that we were just talking about. So that basically means that if you want to meet all these boundaries, we have to completely redesign the way we are constructing our political, legal, economic, social systems worldwide. The problem with this, of course, is that we are locked in many parts of the world. She was talking about the difficulties of communicating this to relatively poorer communities. But communicating this to rich people in rich countries is so difficult too. You know, it's really difficult to tell people, well, perhaps you should not fly so much. Or don't take a holiday abroad. You know, that's really complicated. So the communication job in the North is different from the communication job in the Global South.
So what I'm hearing from you, and this is actually resonating as a communication scientist, is it's a challenge in communication. If we solve the communication challenge, can we overcome some of these massive barriers that we need to?
So, you know, the thing is that people might tell me chocolate is bad for my health, I might still eat it. So even if you communicate to me that something is wrong or something is right, it may not necessarily change my behavior. So you have to really try and figure out what triggers behavioral change. And also, why would somebody here care about somebody far away? Why would somebody care today about a future tomorrow far away? So how do you make that story convincing enough that people want to change their behavior? That's a really big challenge. And that's the challenge we've been facing for the last 50 years, since the last Stockholm conference, the first Stockholm conference.
Okay, well, we've come 50 years. We have 50, what can we accomplish in the next 50 years is a major theme that we'll be covering through the course of this segment. Xie, what have you learned in telling these stories? Are we seeing movement in the right direction?
Well, somebody once asked me, when you talk to politicians or business leaders, what do you tell them? And if there's a politician or a business leader in the climate space, they probably already know at least the base of the facts about the climate crisis. So I tell them stories, because I need them to be shaken to their core. I need them to look at me in the eye and tell me, like, I'm not going to negotiate your future away. And I think that historically we've taken emotion and we've taken all of these things out of negotiations. And I think youth are bringing that specific feature. We're saying you cannot just leave us behind. It's painful that you're leaving us behind, but obviously always backed by listening to the science. And I also come from an indigenous community in Mexico. So what Johan is doing is actually bridging that world of indigenous wisdom that has been protecting Mother Earth and the global commons with the Western ways of like legal language. And how are we bridging worldview and the Western world to protect Mother Earth? That is really what we're getting at. And in the youth movement, we are mobilizing, and our behavior has been changed to really change the world, you know? And this is a world that we're being raised into, that we're growing into. And our goal is to really go into every single space and tell every single person, you have the responsibility to make the climate crisis part of your agenda. And do it with optimism.
Right.
We have the opportunity to change things.
Thank you. And thank you for having that optimism. It's palpable. Johan, some closing thoughts as we round out this segment?
No, you know, I've learned so much working with Joita together on the Earth Commission, because I'm coming at this as a dry Earth system scientist with the numbers. I lack the good stories, and I lack the punch that Joita provides in terms of the legal language. And I think we are at a very interesting turning point now, because the whole sustainability agenda, the storytelling and the narrative based on science is changing. It's changing so fundamentally. I mean, we're in such a geopolitical turbulence in the world today, and we can today say without hesitation that solving the climate crisis, solving the water crisis, solving the biodiversity crisis is about peace, it's about health, it's about security, it's about dignity, it's about equity, it's about Joita's point about having any chance of us, irrespective of what corner of the planet we live on, rich or poor, to have dignity into the future. And I think this is the connections that we are much better at making today. We did not do that 50 years ago. We have it all today, which of course is why Xie and all the fellow youth around the world are doubly frustrated. I mean, not only frustrated that we, the adults, are not acting on the science, but also that acting on the science will give us a better world, a more dignified world. So there's kind of reason for double anger, and I love, I pick some of Xie's power into the science, and that is really helpful. Thanks for that, by the way.
Yes, awesome. Well, thank you for contributing all that you do to encouraging everyone to become planetary stewards of this one global commons that we reside in. So much appreciate your contribution. And for those of you who would like to learn more about tipping points, please follow the link that you see on screen and check out the science and how to tell the stories and so much more. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Now that you're...
I'm thrilled to have with me the incoming new chair of the Global Commons Alliance, Dario Soto Abril. He is the former CEO of Fairtrade International. Please join me on stage, Dario.
Thank you. By the way, I'm also the CEO of the Global Water Partnership.
Your bio is too long.
No worries.
But incredible, and we really appreciate you being here. Please join me at this table.
So I'm looking at that camera over there.
Yes, perfect. At this camera.
Yes.
Yes, so I'm a proud member as well of the Global Commons Alliance Steering Committee and a component board member for Earth HQ. And so let me start by asking you, what is your vision of partnering for planetary stewardship? How do you think about this big picture?
Well, I think it involves different components or elements. One is it's about being inclusive. It has to include different sectors, private sector, civil society, young leaders, that's the one that just discussed and what's in the panel before myself. We also have to have governments, of course, and different members of different movements. So that's one element. The other one has to be geographically broad. It has to include people not only from the global north, but also people from the global south. And it should also include people who are really involved in these kind of conversations, but some others who are not, because then oftentimes you get the same people talking to each other or preaching to the choir. So how can we make this more inclusive? So again, geographically broad is important. It should include, by the way, that all different viewpoints, people who are aware of this, who are not, who are involved, who even are against what we're doing. So that's another big element. And it has to be aligned, getting everybody to be pushing towards the same direction. If you're going to be part of a partnership, you should be willing to put some weight into it, so beyond words, actions.
So you do have many accolades in your CV, and they're incredible. It's that wealth of experience that is really going to lead the Global Commons Alliance into this new definition of what we're trying to usher in for the planet, and to give individuals a role to play, to actually contribute to bringing in a better future. How are you using all your experiences, and feel free to share with us those experiences in some detail, in how you approach equitability and inclusion of individuals from all over the world to be part of this effort?
Well, I think the first experience that I use always is that, more than being a CEO or a chair, I'm also Colombian. I'm also from the Global South. And I never forget, I grew up in a city which is like the Miami of Colombia. It's a great city, beautiful, we have ocean, etc. But just across the city, there's a small town of fishermen and women who have never had water, access to sewage, to water. Water has to be brought up by boat, even though they're just across the city. There's pollution there, the tourism, etc. I never forget that I'm working for them, and when you talk to them, they have no idea. They don't care really about climate change. They just know that they have no access to services, and that water is racing. Now it rains when it shouldn't be raining, it's dry when it shouldn't be dry, and then water keeps coming to their houses. So those are the people from whom I never forget I work for them in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and even in Europe and the US. So that's a fair guiding role. Now, from my experience working with coalitions, I think it's important that we, again, bring alignment. There's a lot of organizations and a lot of movements working on climate, on biodiversity. And all of us are trying to do the best, or of us are looking for this tipping change that we want to create. But how do we create alignment, and how do we pull towards the same direction? That's one big lesson that I've learned in my life. The other one is we need to listen. Again, we oftentimes come to forums where there's a lot of experts who have all the solutions, but they don't listen to each other. I come with my solution, I present it, and I speak to myself. No one really buys to them. So how can we make those solutions and those ideas actionable? And that's the third word, actionable. How do we move from research to really moving the needle in terms of mobilizing people so that they take action, to take ownership of the issue of the 5 global commons?
And you have so much experience in water, and you shared some of this. Yeah. Tell us why water is special and prioritized, but ultimately, there are all the global commons that we need to think about as one part of a big whole.
Well, the beauty about the global commons is we have the 5 global commons: water, oceans, land, climate, biodiversity, and we have an integrated approach to all of them. So, of course, water is one of the 5 I just mentioned. And water is important because it's cross-cutting to all of the activities in human life. And also because there's this perception that because water is everywhere, water is not that relevant in the conversation that we have about the global commons. And what we're seeing more and more is this: we're going towards a world where water is going to be scarce. And where people are going to be suffering too much water, too little water, too much water where it shouldn't be water. So those are the kind of discussions that come from water that they also apply for the other global commons, no?
Absolutely. We're planet water ultimately, aren't we? And yet here we are facing a scarcity issue in so many places in the world. It's one of those paradoxes,
indeed.
Which are many of the paradoxes that we are contending with. So we just had a panel where we heard the science, and we know that we need to communicate and reach audiences to really collectively mobilize to action. How do you think about prioritizing what we ask people to do, and how we ask them to give their time, attention, and resources to addressing these challenges of the global commons?
Well, and we also heard from the panel that we're competing for attention. There's a lot of issues, and the day-to-day priorities of people. It's difficult to cope with climate. I just gave you the example of this fisher community in Colombia. They're dealing with what is in the table to eat this afternoon, and what's happening with corruption. And then you add on top of that climate, which looks like very far in the future, because we've been talking about climate for many years, and for them, like, nothing is happening. So I think one is to translate the topics of the 5 commons towards a narrative that people could understand. And I think that was mentioned in the prior panel, and I could not agree more. I think we need to talk in a way that relates to people, to their day-to-day needs and expectations. And the other one is we should do it in a way that people feel this drive to act. And people could act on the 5 global commons with many ways. They could actually protest, they could talk to their policymakers, they could make donations, they could actually vote for those politicians who are more prone to take action on climate and the 5 global commons. So those are the ways that we need to talk to them in a way that they can relate, maybe using a storytelling narrative. Good example. I'm kind of like outside of the scientific community. It's difficult for people to connect data with actual action. So we need to bring that narrative and that storytelling to them.
Absolutely. And our global audience that is tuning in, those of you that are here in person, thank you for being here. And those of you that are joining us, you're hearing these action steps. You're hearing how we can prioritize the precious time we have to saving the precious planet we have. So how do we encourage human beings to partner with nature, to really truly experience and acknowledge the fact that without planet Earth, planet water, there really is no planet?
Well, I think first is to make all of us, because we're also humans, realize that nature is our, it's cross-cutting, it's our means of life. And it's also, we depend on nature, nature depends on us. So I think that's one element in which we need to bring to people to understand that there's a connection there every day. Even if you live in a big city where there's no trees and everything else, there's the connection with nature. The other one is, how do we create a narrative that helps people, encourage people to take action, to move, to say, hey, this is enough, and we need to act. I think past narratives put the issue of climate, maybe we're scaring people away, so the war is going to end, so there's no even need to act. There's a narrative that say, well, it's 2050 or the year 2100, so it's like I'm not going to be alive by then, so who cares? So we need to bring that narrative to no, the action has to happen right now, and whatever we do now will impact us in 2 and 3 and 5 years. So 2025, 2030, horizons that people could really understand and relate to.
Exactly, because these are slow-moving, potentially seemingly slow-moving, far away, other people. How do we create that urgency and make these stories more tangible for people so that we can move them to act and behave in a way that really tips us in the right direction, not the tipping points, but actually moves us to behavioral change. Well, I'm so excited for you to be leading the Global Commons, and very happy to be part of the team, and looking forward to seeing what you do to usher in a future where we really are committed to being planetary stewards. Well,
happy to be here, and it's such an honor to be on the stage.
Thank you so much, Dario.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We now welcome a keynote speech from Andrew Steer, president of the Bezos Earth Fund. He previously served as president and CEO of the World Resources Institute. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I wish I could be there in real time, but I'm sitting in Washington, D.C.
Oh, this is fantastic that you're able to join us from Washington, D.C., and I was just able to see you in person in Davos. So it'd be fantastic to hear your reflections of the meeting of world leaders and where we think we are moving the needle forward in terms of achieving our massive global crises ambitions.
Great. Well, look, thank you. Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be with you. 30 years ago this week, I was in Rio de Janeiro for the Rio Earth Summit. And it was astonishing then to watch the heads of state go up and sign the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Biodiversity Convention. And there was an amazing sense of sort of moral purpose. There really was a belief that these are issues we need to seize, and we need to seize them right away as a global community. And all the countries in the world were there. They wanted to act collaboratively and cooperatively. Now, it turns out that over the years, we didn't manage to do that. We lost the sense of moral purpose. And the job of Stockholm +50 is precisely to try and rekindle that. I think there's real hope. And I think even on the panels that we've been listening to today, we can hear that. We now have the science in the right place. We heard from Johan. We recognize that things need to be much more inclusive and less top-down. We know that we need to work together. And my job today was to talk a little bit about the System Change Lab. Everybody talks about system change because we now know that's what's necessary. It's no longer good enough to make incremental change. It's no longer good enough to have a pilot success here and a pilot success there. We have 1 decade to radically reform the way we run our economy. And I think Bastita, Johan, Jaita, Dario have all made that point extremely well. So we all know that we need radical changes in energy, in transport, in our food systems, the way we consume, the way we treat each other, the way we approach things equitably. And within each of those, there's a whole bunch of mini revolutions. And what the System Change Lab does is it basically looks at those. There are about 50 of them. And those range from getting rid of the internal combustion engine this decade, to halving food loss and waste this decade, to switching industrial processes towards green cement and green steel, for example. About 50 such changes. And what the System Change Lab does, it asks the question, sort of, how goes the battle? It is, if you like, a situation room that monitors these 50 revolutions that need to take place and asks the question, why are some of them doing quite well and some of them are stuck in the mud? And then it analyzes them and it tries to share information, and then it tries to encourage those that are failing. So, for example, why was it that suddenly plastics became a big issue? And actually there's some incredibly exciting work going on plastics, which 5 years ago would have been unthinkable. Why is it that last week at the World Economic Forum, the issue of green steel suddenly becomes very, very exciting, and the leading steel factories in the world and the leading automobile manufacturers and governments are sitting down with scientists and researchers and NGOs and asking, what would it take to get that kind of change? While some of them sort of aren't making the progress they should. Consider energy efficiency. Should be obvious. It pays for itself within about 3 years. And yet we simply are not making the progress. Why are some doing well and some doing badly? And some of them are heading towards the positive tipping points. Johan this morning talked about, or this afternoon for you in Stockholm, talked about tipping points, meaning bad tipping points that happen to nature. But there are also good tipping points whereby it becomes suddenly so obvious that something needs to be done differently that it becomes unstoppable and irresistible. So smartphones, for example, started slowly, suddenly a tipping point. Everybody uses it. We need exactly the same for electric cars. We need the same for, airplanes that fly on totally and utterly different fuel. We need that for the hydrogen economy and so on. So that's what the System Change Lab does. But some people then ask the question, so what exactly is system change? Well, there's a whole industry out there thinking, an academic industry that's thinking about what is system change. But the sort of simplest way to think about it is that any particular sort of part of economic and social life requires a whole bunch of people and actors interacting with each other. You have buyers and sellers, you have analysts, you have communicators. And system change is when essentially you need almost every different type of player to be part of a solution. No silver bullets, it's a jigsaw puzzle. So for example, take say deforestation in Southeast Asia, losing the most precious tropical forests in the world. What's the cause? 2 words, palm oil. Now, so what to do about that? Well, is palm oil bad? No, palm oil is a wonderful commodity. There are millions of hectares in Indonesia alone, which could be very good for palm oil. They're currently degraded land. What would it take? Well, it's not just something the government can do. It's not just something the private sector can do. You actually need the scientific sector as well to actually monitor what's going. There are 1,000 palm oil mills in Southeast Asia. Which are the good ones doing good work? Which are the dishonorable ones? You actually also need to bring in the whole demand side. You need to think about the traders that are sitting in Singapore trading. You need to think about the manufacturers, the Unilevers, the Nestles. What are they doing? Are they able to monitor the oil palm that comes into their factories? Then you have to think about the consumers. What about the Walmarts, the Lidls, the Tescos? What about you and me? Each of us here have probably used palm oil 3 or 4 times today already. Half of every product in the supermarket contains palm oil. So we need to think of the entire system from when I choose what makeup to put on, what toothpaste to use. I need to be told, what sort of palm oil is this? Is it honorable or is it deforestation full? And that has to go all the way down the line. And the government of Indonesia, the Smallholders Association, the leading manufacturers, and all need to be part of it. So what we need to do is be much more specific, thinking about a situation room where we ask, how goes the battle for each of those? And overall, are we making these transitions in a truly honorable and equitable way? So let me stop there. And if there are any questions, please go ahead.
Yes, Andrew, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those reflections. And I do have a question for you. In the many roles that you've had in your career over the decades and really leading the charge on overcoming the challenges that we're facing as this global collective, today really is it's auspicious in the sense that it's been 50 years and we are appreciating and respecting this date. So what does this date mean to you? And are we going to be able to really see the next 50 years as progress? Are we going to be moving towards where we need to be going based on where we're coming from?
Well, I think we've got a lot to be hopeful for, but we also need to remember that we failed over the last 50 years. So in Stockholm in 1972, you had world leaders, people like Indira Gandhi from India, the Prime Minister of India, coming and saying, look, we've got to do something serious. You had the brilliant Maurice Strong, who was sent to lead UNEP, create the United Nations Environment Program, which has done a very good job over 50 years, but has never been empowered to play the role. We do not have a global governance for the global environmental problems. And I hope and pray that when the leaders meet this week, that they will rise above the kind of incremental approach, and they will actually have the courage to say, we really need sort of global governance to address these issues. The encouraging point is that for the first time, we've got away from the you versus me. We've got away from I'm going to criticize the corporate sector and so on. Yes, there's a lot of blame that should go around, but we will only solve the problem if we work together. So think about the financial sector, which has never done anything really to help climate change, and in many ways has caused a lot of the problems by being very short-term and not having the expertise to understand the risk of nature loss and climate change. Now, for the first time, they're saying we want to be part of the solution. And the asset owners are saying we want honorable investments. And the asset managers are saying we want it too. Now, there's a huge pushback within that sector right now. And we will see this time and time again. And we have to just be very, very strong, as you were saying earlier, about communicating that actually this is not just good for the planet, although that's important. It is good for the future of our humanity. It's good for our economy. It's good for fairness. We don't need to live in the kind of world we're living today.
If we do this right, it really is win-win-win across the board. Thank you for expressing that so clearly. So from your mouth to the policymakers' ears, and we will do our part in amplifying this message. Thank you so much for your time, Andrew, and enjoy the rest of the day in Washington, D.C.
Thanks so much.
Next, I'm thrilled to welcome with me on stage Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, CEO and chairperson of the Global Environmental Facility. Prior to this, Carlos served 3 terms as an environment and energy minister in Costa Rica, where he doubled the size of its country's forests and made its electric sector fully renewable. We also have with us Felicity Silverthorne. She's a coordinator for Global Choice's Arctic Angels, a youth-led intergenerational network advocating for the protection of our global commons. And let us re-welcome Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, co-president of Club of Rome, who will be joining us via Zoom. I will take a seat on this side, switching it up, taking full advantage of the stage. Welcome, Sandrine. So,
welcome everyone. Apologies for not being there in person.
COVID was bound to come for us all at some point, but we wish you a very speedy recovery.
Thank you.
Carlos, GEF is the largest multilateral funder of action to protect the global commons. Donors recently agreed a record replenishment of more than $5 billion to the GEF, 30% higher than the previous funding round. How will GEF and its partners use this money to finance the global commons?
Well, thanks for the very nice question. Let me begin by giving the perspective or the big picture. The $5.3 billion may sound a lot of money, but it's just a drop in a bucket compared to what humans are investing in activities that destroy nature and contribute to climate change. But that drop can be extremely powerful if you know how to use it. And this is what we are looking in GEF 8. This is the new cycle for the GEF. Being able to really understand how do we contribute to the system change, how do we contribute in measuring and assessing that system change, and what has failed in the last many decades, particularly the last 5 decades since we came here, well, the others came here in 1972. So two things are very important that we need to understand that will help us really work on dealing with the implementation gap. One is working on the market failure, and this is very well known. You know, we destroy nature, we deforestate the forests, we pollute the rivers, and that is not reflected how we assess and measure our economy. And just politicians, they take the decisions based on the best available economic information. So if the system that assesses the health of your economy is not providing you the right information, we will definitely keep business as usual. So we need to deal with that major failure, and we're working on many different fronts. The other element is what I call the institutional failure, which is similar to the market failure, but probably less known. Which is the fact that we will never do the leap forward in terms of our aspiration for sustainability with the same institutional framework, how all governments organize themselves, that in first place created the problem. So both elements are extremely important. Both elements contribute to this policy coherence. You know, we invest many more times resources in activities that destroy nature and contribute to climate change than what we invest in protecting. So the GEF is building on a process that began 2 cycles ago, where we began understanding that it's not just dealing with the problem rather than the root case of the problem, being able to think on a more comprehensive manner, understanding all these different elements that contributes into the degradation, which help us to really understand where we should be investing. So the element of 2 elements are important. One is dealing with this lack of policy coherence, and the other is how our resources can mobilize more effectively all financial resources, particularly domestic resources. The major funding source for climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and the protection of nature are public expenditures. So we need to understand how governments can do much better with the resources that are being annually invested through national budgets. So those 2 things are extremely important into the future as we look in the GEF to help countries be more coherent and be able to integrate across conventions and across different sectors.
Amazing. So really, how do we mobilize these different financial institutions and countries and relay the message that while it's expensive, it is still cost-effective to invest in nature?
How many times more? Many times more. And there are multiple reports that tell us that. But unfortunately, the political system is not in favor of our long-term sustainability. You know, I've been in politics, I've been in government, and I know how they work, they operate, and they behave. All politicians, they want 2 things. One is to provide an improvement in the quality of life of people and to be reelected. As simple as that. And you need to take decisions in a term of 4 years. So that is your framework. Under those conditions, it is impossible to be able to break this vicious circle that we are located at this point.
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of the issues that plague us seem farther away, like the ice caps melting. But actually, we're getting to the point where it's very witnessable. So how is it that something like the polar ice caps melting, what role does it play in global economics? And how do we explain to people that this is something truly, if we don't get ahead of now, is really going to run away from us, especially as it comes to global economics?
Well, I think you're completely right there. I mean, the environment and the economy really need to start being treated as one and the same. What we do to nature, how we work with the economy, that has lasting impacts. And I think we know that the Arctic, I mean, it is warming 3 times faster than anywhere else in the world. We are seeing, you know, we're expecting there to be ice-free summers by 2050. We are expecting this to cost, you know, sea ice loss cost to be $70 trillion. That's a cost that's going to impact our global economy, and that's a 10 times amount that was originally projected for Arctic shipping and exploitation. And so I think it's really crucial we recognize that, you know, the Arctic, the Antarctic, these polar landscapes, they are, you know, a lens that's so important for us to recognize. They are a cornerstone for our systems. And if we start to have an interconnected systems approach, we will, you know, safeguard these places for the future. Yeah, I would just, I think it's really frustrating for me as someone that's, you know, in the youth, to not really see the Arctic and the polar landscapes being recognized in this way, and to not really have people talk about them so that they understand the impact that it will have on our economy. You know, we're looking at like short-term gains when we have Arctic exploitation, when we have shipping. All of these countries looking to just, you know, short-term gains for their GDP, and they don't understand that this is going to actually have real long-term expenses. This is going to cost us more in the future if we don't act now to protect what we have already. And I think that's just, yeah, the most important thing.
Exactly. How do we actually spend money on proactively preparing rather than cleaning up after the fact? That's way more expensive. And it doesn't help when you have actors like Elon Musk saying that ESG has been hijacked by phony social justice warriors. And then you have the representative from HSBC calling environmentalists nut jobs. This does not help. Sandrine, let me come to you. What is it, these deep-seated attitudes that is undermining the good work that's being done and the enthusiasm of young people to really make a change here and to really usher in positive work? How do we disentangle the different comments that we hear from the good work that is underway and not treat climate change action as a leftist agenda?
Well, that's a very good question. Maybe I can just give a few reflections from what I've heard so far and build on that, and then give some of my thoughts to the very good question that you've just posed. The first is that we have to remember that this is not only the 50th anniversary of Stockholm +50, but of the Limits to Growth, which was the first seminal publication of the Club of Rome. And the fact that actually we already in 1972 predicted the tipping points that we would be facing. So to come to your question and to come to why systems change is so important is because we've actually never done systems change. We've constantly lived in siloed thinking. Now we're saying that we're as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link through COVID. Look, I'm stuck here. I can't be with you because I just got COVID. And so many others. I think what's really important is to come forward and start to say, exactly as Carlos Manuel was saying, actually, we can do this. We have now actually before us most of the technology that we need. We have most of the capital that we actually need. The problem is short-term decision-making cycles at the policy level and also in the investment cycles. We also know, and in fact, we've been calling and we're going to be launching our largest call so far with many countries from across the globe and the Planetary Emergency Partnership partners, indicating that we have to have a recall to action. We have all these pledges that have been made by governments, whether it be the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, the High-Level Biodiversity Pre-COP Event Pledge, all the pledges that were made at the COPs, the $100 billion, and they're not coming to fruition. Look at the $100 billion. It's been stuck now since Paris. So what we really need to do is recall governments to action. Many of what needs to be done, the words that have been stated in these pledges now just need to be translated. In addition to that, I'd say that we need to get much more creative in terms of the way in which we look at our budgets and the way in which we look at our fiscal spending. And we've come up now through our new work with Johan Rockström and others called Earth for All with some key suggestions on how we can look at new taxation policies, working actually with governments, working towards going beyond the current growth predicament and looking at new indicators to growth. And we know that we, again, have all the tools in the toolbox to do that. We can shift our taxation from people to products. We can ensure that we actually start to tax the wealthy and really do bring in some of that funding to diversify. We can actually put a tax on the global commons to enable actually that global commons to become a citizen fund. There are many ways in which we can do this, but it comes back to Carlos's very, very important point. Short-term decision-making rather than long-term planning for resilience to future shocks and stresses, and the fact that we need political will. That is the call to leaders in Stockholm. We cannot waste another 50 years.
Sandrine, thank you for that outlook for what we need to do in the coming 50 years. And Carlos, let me come to you. How do we incentivize transformation when so many are invested in the current system, like these Elon Musks or these financial institutions? How do we incentivize transformation?
Okay, well, let me begin answering your question by contradicting many people that I have heard this morning, and probably many people that I will hear the rest of this week, saying that what has happened since 1972 is a big failure. I totally disagree with that. In 1977, 5 years after the summit here in Stockholm, a group of scientists published a report in Costa Rica saying that by year 2000, Costa Rica will lost all of their primary forests. We're now 2022, and Costa Rica has twice the size of the forest. The same thing probably happened everywhere in the planet. We were able to revert the tendency of loss of major wildlife. We were able to restore, bring from the brink of extinction many species. Anywhere that we put a political capital and interest, we were able to succeed. And human development is the best example in the last 3 decades. So I'm very optimistic that we have the know-how, we have the resources. We need to be able to really deal with this issue of policy, lack of policy coherence, and the issue of incentives. So it is very well, and one of the main reasons why Costa Rica was able to double the size of the forest was basically because we understood that there were all kinds of negative and perverse incentives, land tenure, banking policies, agrarian reform, policies that promoted land use change. And the same thing is happening everywhere, actually, on all different sectors. So it is not just a matter of political will, it is understanding the decision-making processes within governments. And once again, if you don't understand the political cycle and what is the right kind of information you need to provide them with, you will never be able to achieve that. 2 years ago, I finished a report in Costa Rica where we did the green accounting process, and we came with very interesting numbers. The environmental cost of our development model is around 4% of GDP. And with those numbers, even with the strong support of the president, I went to the Minister of Finance and I said, Minister, these are the numbers. We need to fully internalize all of these negative externalities so we can be able to manage better our natural capital. And the minister asked me, 4% of GDP, you want me to subtract 4% of GDP? We have 5.5 fiscal deficit. I will not be the first minister to report zero growth because you want me to reflect those negative externalities. Do it with another minister, not me.
These are the challenges.
So this is the four-term political cycle that we need to deal with. So we need to understand how do we provide data to those decision makers in a way that we can do the transition. The transition is not a technological issue. It's not going from dirty to clean energy. Yes, we need to do that, but we need to understand what is the transition in the political sector, in the policy-making sector. Otherwise, we will never do the leap forward in terms of the scale that we needed.
Great thoughts to leave us with. Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you, Felicity, and thank you, Sandrine. Felicity, I look forward to welcoming you back at the end of our segment for additional thoughts. Thank you all very much for your time and contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are in a global food crisis of apocalyptic proportions. We are in a global food crisis of apocalyptic proportions. Even before the war in Ukraine, food prices were going up and climate impacts, such as the recent record-breaking heat in Pakistan and India, were decimating harvests. Is it even okay to deliver art projects based on food during a global food crisis? So I'm thrilled to have with me on stage Turner Prize-winning artist Jeremy Deller and Ayesha Sadiq, a Pakistani-American environmentalist, poet, and co-founder of Polluters Out and Fossil Free University. Thanks, both of you, for joining me here today. Jeremy, let's start with you. Can you describe your thinking and creative process on God Gron? Why food?
Well, I was asked to do an artwork around this conference, and I wanted to engage the public, and I felt the best way to do that would be with food. And we're giving away food. What's one thing we're doing? And I just felt that everyone has that in common, but also people like being given free food. And also we're working with schools and school dinners for children. So it's a two-pronged attack, as it were, but it's all based around food.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember from my American university days, if there was free pizza on offer, I would definitely be there, so.
Yeah, I mean, we all need it.
We're pulling on those heartstrings.
Yes, and the food we're serving, as it were, for the children in the schools, the ingredients are, amongst other things, kelp and insects. So probably be the first time they've tasted insects or had it in their food. But it's the kind of food sources that maybe we'll be eating more and more in the future. So that's one reason. And also the bar we're giving away in the street also has kelp in it, which is a local ingredient.
Absolutely. Local, sustainable, and alternative proteins for future food security. Ayesha, tell us about Fossil Free University.
So my background is in organizing, specifically youth organizing, and I started protesting with Fridays for Future around 2019, and I was actually pretty let down after we, the youth, had mobilized 7 million people. In the US, we had mobilized perhaps one of the biggest youth-led protests on American soil for people ages 4 to 16. What occurred after that was massively disappointing from the United Nations, the UNFCCC specifically, and the turnout of COP25. The purpose of Fossil Free University is to teach people, youth, and those who are involved in activism, who the actual culprits of this climate crisis are, and why calling them out is absolutely pivotal. A lot of times when we talk about climate initiatives and climate demands and goals, we pivot automatically to the Paris Climate Agreement. But do you guys know that the words oil, gas, or fossil fuel are not even mentioned in this document? People come to COP year after year with hope that things will change, that parties will negotiate. But do you know, for the past 27 years, COPs have been sponsored fiscally by the fossil fuel industry. So of course we're not getting anywhere. The same people who are causing the crisis have a big influence on the legislation and policy that is coming out of it. So Fossil Free University, first, we teach people what is going on. 2, then we arm them with the tools needed to take on some of the biggest corporations on Earth. It is not easy, and it's not simple. For every one lawyer we have, the fossil fuel industry has hundreds. For every $1 we have, they have hundreds.
Wow. So the work you're doing is absolutely critical in increasing awareness, education, and ultimately moving people to act. We need people to learn. We need people to be able to change their minds, not just stick to the status quo. How does art do that, Jeremy? How from your experience, how do people learn and change their minds through this exposure to different food sources and creative products?
Well, we haven't done the project yet, so we're not sure, but I think art can give you just a different entry point. And maybe artists think slightly differently about problems. Artists, they obviously think creatively, in a sense, and work creatively. And I think they can help communicate ideas in a way that maybe science finds difficult sometimes by making experiences rather than facts, as it were. I know that sounds a bit trite, but I think artists sometimes, are great communicators and can connect with the public in a way that maybe science doesn't directly.
And we need everyone to play their role. We need creatives involved, and we need to break down the silos and cross-communicate and share good learnings and ideas. And then ultimately we can think about how to work with people in power and against power. How do you think about that, Aisha? How do you think about how to work with and against power, given some of the infrastructures in power have led us to where we are now?
I think it was Emma Goldman who said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. The best way that youth have been able to stand up against power is take this jargon that has been in silos of scientific community, not on purpose necessarily, but because it was a language that was not accessible, and make it accessible for millions. Whether it was through social media or through our campaigns or through our chants, but we actively try to bring joy to our protests. We bring song, we bring printmaking and art, we bring color. And that's necessary to be in a space, or also honestly fighting the gravity of the situation at hand. Everything we love and know is at risk. And the only way that I know to keep going is to have radical hope, sometimes to the point of naivete, but you need that. You need to be a little headstrong for this to work. We haven't gone anywhere in terms of treaties, legislations change, just by stacks of papers. What shifts the legal perspective or the political perspective is people power, it's people energy. So yeah, just I see it in hand and in community. That's how I think we can challenge power.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing all of that. That's very optimistic for the new approaches we can take to encouraging people to contribute, to getting involved. Creative learning, right? So what do you think, Jeremy? What is the future of creative learning for the planet?
Well, I think it has to be for everybody. It has to be all ages, and it has to be planet-wide in that respect. It can't just be for us, as in myself, people in the West who have a sort of, in a privileged position. But I think you're right, art gives hope, it gives comfort, even in the most dire situations, and it always has done historically. So it absolutely should be used now as one of our tools to get messages across, but also to give us a sense of community as well.
So art, dance, song, color, and so much more. Aisha, I'm going to welcome you back at the end of the segment to reflect on your thoughts from today. And so look forward to hearing what you think about the additional segments that are coming up. And I really just want to say thank you. Thank you for contributing your unique skills to confronting and overcoming the climate crisis.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we will be discussing science-based targets for nature. I have in studio with me Erin Billman, Executive Director of the Science-Based Targets Network. And joining us via Zoom is Luis Amaray, the CEO of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is driving ambitious climate action in the private sector. Also via Zoom is Martha Stevenson, Senior Director of the Strategy and Research on the Forest Team at WWF US, leading conservation of the world's most important forests. So this is a fantastic panel to learn about science-based targets for nature. Erin, let me start with you. You're leading the charge on nature targets. What are you working on, and how does climate relate to nature?
So what I'm working on is science-based targets for nature for companies and cities. There are already climate science-based targets in existence. Luis here representing SBTI, and we're now expanding on that to cover nature broadly, which includes land, freshwater, oceans, and biodiversity. Essentially, you've heard about the need for system solutions, and we've tackled climate too much in silo in the past. And climate change is one of the leading causes of nature loss, but also nature is our biggest ally in the climate change battle, with nature absorbing over half of emissions. And so we're basically expanding on the approach that we've taken with climate science-based targets and broadening that to all the ways in which companies and cities impact and depend on the environment. And targets are science-based if they are, by definition, using the best available science, if they're measurable, and if they enable a company or a city to do their part to meet a global goal like the Paris Agreement.
Fantastic. Thank you for saying that so clearly. As we're trying to figure out the relationship with climate, nature, how to speak about science-based targets. So, Luis, let me come to you. SBTI is a leader in supporting companies to set ambitious climate targets in line with science. So what does the climate-nature connection evoke for you, as after what we just discussed and identified? And what advice would you pass on to SBTN as they start to issue nature targets?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I must say I'm a little bit biased on this subject. I spent almost 20 years of my life working mostly on nature issues, supporting sustainable global food systems and eliminating deforestation from supply chains, and investing in towards better local rural livelihoods. So I lead this organization that is setting science-based targets for the climate, but I'm obviously biased towards nature. The key message is that, as Erin said, we will not achieve net zero carbon emissions without nature playing a stronger role, both within the agriculture and forest sector and through nature-based solutions, right? As Erin pointed out, it's part of the equation. Those things are interlinked. And if we're talking about net zero carbon emissions in the future, we need to bring nature into that discussion. If I had one piece of advice, and we're partners with Erin and we already discussed that, I think and she mentioned it a little bit, is what does not get measured does not get managed. We need strong nature accounting systems and measurable KPIs to advance, to promote the advancement of science-based targets for nature. For climate, it's relatively easy, as hard as it sounds, because we have a common measurable unit, right? Tons of carbon. It's global. It's applicable anywhere. For some of the nature aspects, sometimes that measurement is a little bit harder. So without measuring and setting those KPIs, that's the first step to setting science targets, right? You have to measure and know that what success looks like in quantifiable ways, because if that doesn't happen, then it becomes a storytelling competition. And the good news is that for nature, as everyone will be able to tell, there's a lot of things that has been done on that front as well, specifically when it comes to deforestation and reforestation, for example, which is easier to measure. For some other aspects, it will be a little bit harder, but measure in order to manage, so you can actually set targets that we can follow up on them. It's absolutely important.
Great, thank you for that. Martha, let me bring you into this, since you've worked on both SBTI and SBTN target development. Tell us about this new flag methodology for SBTI and the critical bridge you see building between the climate and nature agendas.
Great, thank you so much. It's so nice to be with all of you. So midsummer, we'll be issuing the flag targets, which is forest, land, and agriculture targets for companies to set targets on climate within those sectors. And this is critical because the forestry and agriculture sector right now contributes 22% to global emissions. And as Louise highlighted, has the potential to contribute 30% to the climate mitigation solution through these nature-based solutions. The development of this methodology, it's filling this critical gap in the SBTI toolkit, as before today, the majority of companies have not been including these emissions and actions in their climate strategies. And so that's almost a quarter of global emissions that have not been addressed. So this is really exciting for that reason. And we estimate that when we look at everything that needs to happen in the land sector from a climate perspective, about 60% of that needed mitigation will come from companies in the food and forestry sectors. So activating here is critical. This includes activities like reducing emissions from deforestation, agricultural emissions, stopping food waste, shifting diets, many of the actions we've heard about already today. But then also, because within the land sector we sequester carbon as well, we need to do things like increasing carbon sequestration from improved management of forests, improved management of soils and pasture lands. And so this is where we can really directly connect the nature and climate agendas together. If we take a step back and look at the surface of the Earth, about 63% of the livable surface are those working lands that I just described. And so if you take away ice and deserts and high mountains, 63% of what's left are working lands. So that's pasture land, farmland, and working forest. And that's a huge percentage of the Earth. So we often focus for the nature agenda on protected areas, and those are absolutely critical for so many reasons. But if we want to achieve our global climate and nature goals, we need that 63%, those working lands, to deliver food, fiber, and fuel, and also be part of the nature climate solution. So the FLAG project will incentivize the management of those lands to be aligned with climate targets, and the land and biodiversity targets we're developing within the Science-Based Targets Network that Erin is leading will also align those working lands with the nature agenda. So that's the critical connection between this work.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for making that connection. And Erin, let me come to you. So let's tie this back to the Earth Commission. How do science-based targets relate to Earth Commission, the work that Joyita and Johan are doing?
Yeah. Well, as you heard earlier from both Joyita and Johan, they're working on defining the safe and just, environmentally safe and socially just corridor for humanity. The guardrails that come out of that work are part of the scientific underpinning for the work that we do then in the network of translating that science into what it means for a company or a city to make sure that their target incents enough of the right action in the right places at the right time to ladder up to meeting that, staying within that guardrail that the Earth Commission's defined.
Fantastic. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So now that we're hearing so many calling for these integrated SBTs across so many of these different initiatives, Louise, let me ask you, what's it going to take? Are we going to be able to see these integrated SBTs come into fruition?
Thank you, Sweta. I think that's exactly the direction of travel, right? If we look down the road, we need to start to move towards that direction. Obviously, we need to take steps at a time because, as mentioned, those things, although interlinked, sometimes it's very hard to measure them and get them into the right place. But I wanted to just end with a quick message on how I believe that the work that SBTI does on climate actually helps the nature agenda as well. And I think there are two folds in how those things interact. Well, first, I think it was discussed a little bit that in order for nature-based solutions to really take off, we need quality assurance of supply, right? And there are so many institutions that are doing that, trying to ensure that projects or investments in nature-based solutions actually meet the quality assurance. We actually, how we support that agenda is that we are doing the quality assurance of the demand side of that equation, right? As companies are setting science-based targets for climate, they have some work to, and we encourage them to do some work beyond the supply chains as well. And we are soon going to be developing more specific standards for beyond supply chain mitigation strategies. but they have to be reducing their emissions, and that actually is doing two things once they're setting science-based targets for climate. One is that it's guaranteed the integrity of the demand, which means that those companies that are demanding nature-based solutions actually also have something on climate. So if they're going for nature-based solutions, they're also reducing their emissions. So there's integrity of the demand there. And the second thing is actually creates demand for nature-based solutions. As companies set their science-based targets for climate, and they look on different ways to go beyond just their value chain, that's actually creating more demand for this nature-based solutions. And that's when those two agendas really start to merge together. But we cannot just treat them independently. Again, we need to reduce climate emissions and therefore go for nature to tackle some of the emissions that happen beyond their value chains.
Thank you, Luis. Erin, you have some thoughts you would like to share on this topic?
Yep. Well, while climate is out ahead, I'm excited to share that we are starting to play catch up. We have our first freshwater methods coming out later this year, and we're pushing toward our first science-based targets for nature in early 2023. And so that will be the first step forward in terms of integrated science-based targets. And then I think in terms of what it's going to take getting real in places, because when you're talking about wedding the climate agenda with the nature agenda, you have to the nature agenda is very place-based. It matters where you are. And so if you're looking only at a climate target, it might incent the planting of thirsty eucalyptus monoculture in the tropics, which is exactly not what you need for the long-term solution. And so if you tackle that in an integrated manner, you're going to be planting the right trees in that place so that you've got benefits not only for climate, but also for biodiversity and freshwater and the other aspects of the environment.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Erin, Luis, and Martha, for the work that you're doing to really integrate the different science-based targets and to scale them. It looks like this really will become reality, and climate and nature need to be talked about in the same breath. So thank you to each of you for what you are doing and for contributing your expertise to this segment. In our final panel, let's bring back Aisha, Felicity, and Jie. Bastida. So, ladies, youth activists, warriors for our planet, I'd love to hear your reflections from today. What have you heard throughout the course of this Global Commons Alliance segment? What are your thoughts, reflections, warnings, optimism? Feel free to take it where you will and give us your reflections. Let's start with you.
Well, my first reflection is that I think that we are moving in the right direction. I think that we are finally recognizing that we're all connected, that science shouldn't be done in silos. It should be done knowing that what research is done here has an impact here, and that is what we're trying to communicate to the world. That it's not just about what's happening in your community, but how our actions impact what's going on in the world, where we get our food, where we get our clothes, everything is connected. And that means that you can be an activist and act upon something in every single space that we really have an impact on. So that's my reflection, that we are on the right direction of recognizing the intersectionality of science, people, and the world.
Incredible. Aisha.
I have a lot of gratitude for the speakers who took their time out to share information with us today, and whether it was the science or whether it was from people who work in the United Nations. But one reflection I have is, what are the next steps? What are we going to do about it? And I had some thoughts I wanted to share. This year is expected. It is expected that the official definition of climate finance will be adopted to address the issue of monitoring contributions. And next discussions on this topic will take place from June 17th to the 18th. At this moment, in 2022, meeting and exceeding the $100 billion goal this year already, and increasing the pace of exceeding that target all the way up to 2025 to compensate for previous undeliverability is absolutely necessary. Actually, it's absolutely non-negotiable.
Yeah, and I want to add to that before we go to Felicity. We have also been talking about what's going on around Stockholm, the side events. What are people talking about? We're talking about things like a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. How do we make it so that the fossil fuels that are fueling the climate crisis are phased out? How do we justly transition towards that? So that's something that we're also going to be focusing on. And the last thing is about ecocide. Ecocide is legal procedures to make destruction of nature illegal in a legally binding way. And these are the things that indigenous communities are having a lot of say upon. So I think it's really important to see like how we're using all of this knowledge that we have and taking it further and connecting it to legal frameworks that we can use to protect the planet.
We absolutely need to make the destruction of the environment illegal.
Right. Sounds pretty obvious when you say it like that. From the youth's mouths to the ears of the policymakers who have so much power, but ultimately determine your futures. So thank you for sharing that. Felicity, let me come to you.
Thank you. I would say that from reflections today and from this amazing event, and thank you to We Don't Have Time for putting this on, we have the answers. It's pretty clear at this point that we've had them for a long time. Now we have the technology, now we have the capital, and now combined with those answers, combined with youth voices, combined with leadership around the world wanting to make active change for the environment for our futures, so that when we're sat here in 50 years' time, we're not looking back at ourselves as young women just thinking, like, what was the point? Why were we here? What has changed? That's what we're saying, that's what we're reflecting on. And I would like people to take away from this that we understand, we're not naive, we know what's happening, we know what was happening back in 1972, and we know what's happening now, and we know that something needs to be done. We've had enough talking about it, and I think that this is the time where you can see from grassroots movements that voices can really make a difference, and now they need to be put to a purpose. And that's something that I would really encourage people to try and get involved in where they can. I mean, even just from a global choices point of view, we have an Arctic Ice Force. We're calling for a moratorium to protect the Arctic so that it's there, so that we can protect that landscape, so that it can continue to act as an ecosystem that really benefits the planet, benefits us, benefits wildlife. It's paramount at this point. Like, we're past the point of no return. It's not about keeping it, 1.5. It's more than urgent. And so I would encourage people to join where they can, raise their voices where they can.
Why is this moment so pivotal?
The General Secretary in the last IPCC report said that let me backtrack a little because I forgot his words. I was focusing on this quote. He said that intervals will not save us. Working slowly will not save us. It is absolutely important because on June 3rd, the youth will take to the streets again, like we have been doing for the past 3 years. And we are making our requests to the United Nations, to parties, to you guys, very explicit. First, we absolutely need the $100 billion commitment plus more to show up in terms of finance. The money needs to show up. 2, we need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that is applied and not just left as another piece of paper like the Paris is. And ecocide must be made illegal. The earth is crying out. We need to listen to her.
The other reason why it's a pivotal moment is because we come to these spaces, we talk to you, and it's like we're making ourselves vulnerable for leaders to care about us. We're sharing our stories. Not everybody does that. we are being put in a place where we have to show everything about our lives and our fears of the future for people to look at us and care about us. It shouldn't be that way. It should not be that we're begging people to care for the planet. It should be that it's their calling. And that is what we really want, for everybody to become an activist. It shouldn't be demands. It should be, what can I do to take care of this world? That is something that my dad taught me. We are not on Earth to take care. We are not on Mother Earth to take over. We are here to take care. And another quote that I also heard today is, we have to walk on Earth with love because she holds you. And these are the type of relationships that we're not used to hearing. We're not used to hearing how we're part of Mother Earth and how Mother Earth is part of us. And the youth is coming in, bringing in this new worldview and also saying, you have to protect our future with all of the science, the money, the technology, the information that is there. And for us, it is life or death, because we are seeing statistics like 1.2 billion climate refugees by 2050, 19% of the world uninhabitable by 2070, entire island nations underwater. It is not abstract, and we cannot keep acting like it's abstract. We have to put in all of our effort into climate justice, and there is no other greater purpose that we have.
Beautifully said. I mean, it couldn't be more clear when you say it like that. All three of you and many others that are really at the forefront of this activist movement to draw attention to human beings, that we are one and the same with nature. It's easy to remove yourself from it and look at it from the outside. And we've seen these beautiful visuals on the screen behind us, and we've heard very clearly from global citizens of the world, especially those who are indigenous and really recognize how special nature is, just intrinsically. But we need to be able to communicate that and bring those who have lost sight of their role as environmental stewards and those who can actually recognize and carry the banner of being planetary stewards. That is the real takeaway from this session and from this entire conversation for today as we kicked off our first day of Stockholm +50. Thank you, ladies, so much for your comments, your contributions, the work that you do, and I hope that the policymakers will hear you and prioritize the demands that you made here today. So thank you very much for your contributions and your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Climate strike, you better come, please come.
1 p.m.
Check FFF Stockholm for the details.
So I'd like to welcome my colleagues on stage. And before we close, we would like to take a moment of quiet to acknowledge that we actually are a part of nature. And we did hear the youth activists in the previous panel just now. So with that, let's just take a moment of quiet. Thank you for taking that moment of quiet with us. Welcome, colleagues. We've made it to the end of the day.
Fantastic. And I'd like to introduce, this is a new guest Well, actually, he's part of our team, but you in the studio area, maybe from watching all over the world, you probably have seen Patrick Kiari from our Kenya broadcast before. So it's fantastic for me to be sharing the stage with Patrick from Kenya, who runs the Kenya operations, and of course, Shutta, that is president of the US operations, and of course, the founder, Ingmar Rentzhog, here today. So I'd like to ask you, Shutta, first. Fantastic work, by the way. What are your main takeaways from your sessions? There were several, and the theme.
I think there's a real recognition that we are all part of a global commons, that climate and nature are one and the same, and climate, nature, and humans are one and the same. It's easy to remove ourselves from what the planet is suffering from, but ultimately, when the planet suffers, we suffer. And if we start to think about us as an integrated whole, and recognizing that when the commons are being devastated, that human and humanity and the future of our planet, the future of our very existence on this planet is being decimated, that to me is the most clear takeaway. And then the youth, just how obvious it is for the youth, but it takes us a moment to catch up and figure it out. And the distance between the policymakers, not just in age, just that lack of connection to the natural environment versus the young people who seem like they can understand it and breathe it in and out and express it so beautifully to our audience, not just here in person, but also to our global audience tuning in. And that connection to me was everything today. I think it was an incredible way to kick off this week and the really critical, important outcomes that need to happen this week as well as we move towards COP27.
Indeed. Well, it's basically, it's existential. It's an existential threat, and we felt that today. So before I turn to you, Patrick, Ingmar, your main takeaways from this first day of 5 broadcasts?
My takeaway is that it's been a fantastic day. I learned so much, and it's always give me a lot of hope to see people that are really working on solution and working on getting other people active and see them on the same stage. And have an audience. We had so far 4 million viewers this day.
Wow.
And that's a good start because we're going to grow. I think my main takeaway is that we really don't have time, of course. But we see now that there is initiatives like Ecocide that we're not so far away for actually going to happen, even though Sweden is lagging behind, unfortunately. Sweden is actually lagging behind in many things. There's no clear agenda for the Stockholm +50 meeting. And just 1 month before the meeting, Sweden sent a letter to the United Nations lowering the money we're paying to the climate and other organization for UN. I don't think that is taking the lead. It's quite the opposite. So that is not making me proud to be in Sweden. But what's making me proud to be in Sweden is being here in the room together with you. We have had over 80 nationalities represented here today. And I mean, we're not a country, we are a planet, and let's protect that.
Wonderful. And Patrick, you arrived when? Was it today?
No, I just arrived yesterday.
Yesterday.
All the way from Africa. And it's amazing to be here and to realize how we don't have time is a game changer in this course toward our world or toward our Mother Earth.
And your expectations, Patrick, or your hopes and expectations from what might come out of this meeting here in Stockholm, from your perspective, what is that?
Is to see that change, is to see that voice working from policymakers and all people who are here and listening to us all over the world. We need that voice to go to everywhere, to every village, in every part of the world. And I believe we can win. And this is the time in this Stockholm +50, we need to move more forward than before.
Thank you. And you're really working very well in Kenya, because we have many viewers and many followers in Kenya. That's very much thanks to you and your team.
Thank you so much. We are happy for that.
Speaking of team, Ingmar, we're all in this together. We are a team. And how can people interact and support and work together on the app?
Yes, so what you can do on the app is that you can continue the dialogue with the speakers we have had on stage. So ask if you have a question for one of the speakers you have seen here today or later this week, go to the app and put that question there, and hopefully you will get a direct answer from them, because We Don't Have Time is all about the dialogue. We need to work together, and we also need to work together with people we don't agree on. And in order to do that and move forward, we need to have a dialogue. So that's what We Don't Have Time is all about, having a dialogue. Even with the oil companies, you can have a dialogue on We Don't Have Time. But you can also, as I explained earlier today, send climate love as soon as you see someone acting for the climate. It could be a solution, or it could be an activist advocating for change, or someone that actually doing something good. You could give them climate love to showcase that to others, so more people follow. And when you see someone lagging behind, you can also tell them that. Not to shame them, but to politely ask them to change, because we need to change. And I think most people know that. They're still resisting, but with a little help of us getting together with technology like We Don't Have Time, I think we can do it. And I have one good news. I had this question in the beginning.
Oh yes, tell us.
And we had the poll on Twitter. And last time I checked it, in the beginning of today, it was 63% were very pessimistic. They thought it was between 0 to 25%. 63% was very negative, thinking that we were not going to meet the emission target in the Paris Agreement. Now when I checked it, it was actually about 10% lower. So it's only 53% that thinks that we're not going to make it.
Excellent.
And I think we have done something to that. And that's important, because the only way to solve this is to have the mentality that we will solve this. Look at Ukraine. It's a war in Ukraine. No one thought from the beginning that Ukraine could stand up to Russia. But they are doing that. And they will never, ever have a chance to win if they don't think that they will win that war. And I think they will. And it's the same thing with the climate. We need to do everything we can. And if we don't believe in victory ourselves, we will not make it. So that is what I want everyone to take away from here, that we will make it, but it will take a lot from everyone. We can't have anyone on the sideline. So that is my takeaway, and also what I want
and your call to action, I'd say,
to do.
Well, thank you so much, Ingvar. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Shota. And we'll see you again tomorrow. We have our second day broadcast here from space in Stockholm. And tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, you will meet our dear colleague Nick Nuttall, who will take it away from the stage here again. So meet you then. Bye-bye.